My father has a book on his shelf that he's been reading since 1975. Not rereading. Reading. He goes back to it every couple of years, opens it at a random page, sits with it for an hour, closes it, puts it back. 50 years of that. The book is called Bruce Lee, The Man Only I Knew. It was written by Linda Lee, Bruce's wife, 2 years after he died. It came out in October 1975. My father bought his copy in November of that year, in a used bookstore in Ann Arbor that doesn't exist anymore. On the inside cover he wrote his name and the date in pencil. The pencil is still there. The paper around it has yellowed. There are 217 pages in this book. Over 50 years my father has underlined exactly 14 passages. I've counted them. Most of them are short, single sentences, a few words, a phrase. The longest one is on page 47. The paragraph on page 47 is about Bruce's mornings. Linda writes that her husband would get up between 4:15 and 4:30 almost every day. He would slip out of bed without waking her. He would go into the living room, or, in the houses they lived in later, into a small study he kept for himself. He would stay there for about 2 hours. Then he would come back, make tea, and begin the day with the family. She didn't know exactly what he did in those 2 hours. He never told her in detail. He never invited her to join him. He never invited anyone. She writes that it wasn't a secret. It was just his. My father underlined that paragraph the first week he had the book. He was 28 years old. Father, I underlined it because I thought it was about discipline. About a man who got up before everyone else. That's what I thought it meant when I was 28. I thought, here is a man who was harder than the rest of us. Here is a man who took 2 hours away from sleep every day. That's what I saw. Father, 40 years later I think it means something else. Took me a long time to see it. The last video on this channel was about who flew up to Seattle when Bruce died. About a sealed envelope my father carried on that plane and always wondered about. If you haven't seen it, the link is below. This one is about something different. This one is about what Bruce actually did between 4:30 and 6:30 in the morning, for the last 6 or 7 years of his life. As far as we can reconstruct it. I'll say this up front, because it matters. Nobody knows the full picture. Linda didn't know. His students didn't know. The biographers who came later mostly skipped this paragraph, or mentioned it in one sentence and moved on to the fights. What we actually have is 4 fragments. The first is Linda's book, the paragraph on page 47, and a few other mentions scattered through later chapters. The second is Bruce's own training notebooks. He kept them from around 1965 until the month he died. They were published in 1999 by a man named John Little, in a volume called Bruce Lee, Artist of Life. The notebooks contain schedules. Hour-by-hour plans. What he did and when. The third is an interview with Taiki Kimura, who trained with Bruce in Seattle between 1959 and 1964, before any of the fame. Taiki knew Bruce's habits when Bruce was 19, 20, 21. The morning routine was already there. It wasn't something he invented when he became famous. It was something he'd been building since he was a teenager. The fourth is a set of interviews with Dan Inosanto, who trained with Bruce in Los Angeles in the late 60s and early 70s. Dan said, in several interviews across the decades, that when Bruce arrived at the afternoon sessions, he arrived already warm. Already loose. Already somewhere that the rest of them hadn't been yet that day. Dan called it, in one interview, showing up at mile 3 of a race we hadn't started. 4 fragments. Linda's paragraph. The notebooks. Kimura's memory. Inosanto's observation. From those 4 fragments you can build a picture. It's not a complete picture. But it's a real one. Father, what I want to say before this starts is, this is not a tutorial. I am not telling you to wake up at 4:30. I'm not telling you it'll change your life. It probably won't. It didn't change mine. Father, what it did was, it gave me one paragraph to think about for 40 years. That's a different thing from changing your life. That's something else. This is a video about that paragraph. Let's start with Linda. The paragraph on page 47 is the longest mention, but it isn't the only one. If you read the book carefully, and my father has read it more carefully than most people, there are 6 other places where Linda mentions the morning hours. Short. In passing. A sentence here, a line there. Taken together, they tell you a few concrete things. The first concrete thing is the time. She says 4:15 to 4:30. Not 5. Not 6. That's unusually early even for early risers. It means he was going to bed by 9:30 at the latest, to get any real sleep. Linda confirms this elsewhere in the book. They almost never stayed up late, they almost never went out at night, and when they did, Bruce was tired the next morning in a way he wasn't on normal days. The second concrete thing is the location. In their first house in Los Angeles, he used the living room. Later, when they moved to a larger place, he had a small study. In Hong Kong, in the last year of his life, he used a garden room, what Linda calls a covered porch, that opened onto the back of the house. Different rooms. Same habit. The third concrete thing is that he didn't want company. Linda is careful about how she says this. She doesn't say he was secretive. She says he was, and I'm quoting, protective of this time, not from us, but for us. That phrasing is specific. She's saying he wasn't hiding something from the family. He was keeping something in a place where the family wouldn't have to share it with him. Those are different things. The fourth concrete thing, and this is the one my father kept coming back to, is that Linda says she could tell, when Bruce came out of the 2 hours, that he was different than when he went in. Calmer. Quieter. More himself, she writes. Not keyed up. Not sweating. Not exhausted. More himself. She uses that phrase twice in the book, once on page 47 and once about 100 pages later. More himself. Father, that phrase is the one. That's the phrase I've been carrying. She didn't say he was sharper. She didn't say he was stronger. She said he was more himself. That means whoever he was when he came out of that room was closer to the real him than who he was during the day. Think about what that means. Most of us, the person we are in the morning alone is a worse version. Tired. Grumpy. Not ready. For him it was the other way. The version of him that existed in those 2 hours was the truest one. The rest of the day was him coming down from it. Now let's go to the notebooks. Bruce kept training notebooks from around 1965 until July 1973, the month he died. Most of them survived. Linda kept them in a box after he died. Decades later, in the late 90s, a writer and archivist named John Little went through the box with her permission and published large sections of it. The volume is called Bruce Lee, Artist of Life, published in 1999. If you want to know what Bruce actually did in his training, this is the book. In the notebooks there are daily schedules. Not every day. But enough of them, scattered across the years, that you can see the pattern. Here's what the pattern looks like, reconstructed from the notebooks. 4:30 to 5. 30 minutes. He called it, in one entry, sitting. In another, breath. In another, the first quiet. This was not meditation in the Zen sense. Bruce was skeptical of formal meditation and said so in several interviews. It was closer to what a modern sports scientist would call introspective focus. Sitting still. Watching the body wake up. Breathing slow. No technique. Just attention. 5 to 5:45. 45 minutes. Movement without resistance. Forms. Shadowboxing. What he called flow work. Not hitting anything. Not lifting anything. Just his own body moving through its full range, at moderate speed, over and over. The notebooks have diagrams. Sequences of positions drawn in pen. Arrows between them. Little notes in the margin like slower here or don't force the hip. 5:45 to 6:15. 30 minutes. This is the part that looks the most like what you'd imagine training to be. Push-ups. Isometric holds. Balance work. He was obsessive about single leg balance, holding positions for 2, 3, 4 minutes. Strength, but not heavy. He wasn't lifting. This wasn't about getting bigger. It was about making what he had work better. 6:15 to 6:30. The last 15 minutes. Reading and writing. He kept books by the chair, philosophy, mostly. Krishnamurti. Alan Watts. Some Bertrand Russell. He would read for 10 minutes and write for 5. The notebooks are full of these morning entries. A quote from a book, then 2 or 3 sentences of his own response. Small handwriting. Ink pen. Then he would stop. Make tea. Go back to the family. That's the structure. 30, 45, 30, 15. 2 hours. And here's the thing my father pointed out to me that I want to make sure you hear. Father, look at the shape of it. He doesn't start with the hard work. He starts with sitting. Then he starts moving slow. Then he does the strength. Then he reads. The strength part is in the middle. The beginning is quiet and the end is quiet. Most people, if they're going to do 2 hours in the morning, they'd front load it. They'd do the hard stuff first, get it over with, ease out. He did it the other way. He came in quiet. He went out quiet. The work was in the middle, wrapped in silence on both ends. Father, that's not a workout. That's a ceremony. Now let's bring in Taiki Kimura. Taiki was one of Bruce's first students, and one of his closest friends. They met in Seattle in 1959. Bruce was 19. Taiki was 36, 17 years older than Bruce, but Bruce was the teacher. That's a whole other story. The point for this video is that Taiki knew Bruce before he was famous. Before Hollywood. Before the films. Before Linda, even they met a year before Bruce met Linda. In a series of interviews given in the 90s and early 2000s, Taiki mentioned the mornings several times. He said Bruce already had the habit in Seattle, when he was a 19-year-old student at the University of Washington. Bruce was living in a small apartment above a restaurant. He would get up before dawn, go down to the empty restaurant floor, the owner let him use it, and work alone for 2 hours before anyone else came in. Taiki said Bruce did this every day he knew him, for the 5 years they overlapped in Seattle. 5 years of that habit before he even moved to Los Angeles. Before he married. Before he had children. Before he had a career. The 2 hours were already there, already shaped, already fixed. Taiki said something in one of those interviews that I want to read directly. He said, Bruce was not a morning person. He was a person who had found that the morning was where he could do his real work without the world's interference. There is a difference. A morning person likes mornings. Bruce used them. Used them. And finally, Dan Inosanto. Dan trained with Bruce in the Los Angeles years. Mid-60s through the early 70s. He was there at the Chinatown School, there at Bruce's home sessions, there when Bruce was developing what later became Jeet Kune Do. Dan has talked about Bruce in probably more interviews than anyone else, hundreds of them over the decades. What Dan said about the mornings is simple. He said Bruce would arrive at the afternoon sessions, usually 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, and he was already warm. Already loose. Already somewhere. Dan said in one interview it was like they were starting the race and Bruce was already at mile 3. Dan and the other students would spend the first 20 minutes stretching, getting their blood moving. Bruce would skip that. He didn't need it. His body was already open. His mind was already in. Dan eventually asked him about it. Not directly, that wasn't how they talked, but sideways, in the way students ask teachers things. He said something like, "You always seem ready." And Bruce said, and Dan quotes this in at least 2 places, Bruce said, "The work before the work is the work. The work before the work is the work." Father, that sentence is the whole thing. That sentence is what the 2 hours were. They weren't preparation for his day. They weren't warm up. They were the actual thing. The rest of the day, the filming, the teaching, the interviews, the fights, all of that was the surface. The 2 hours were where he actually did what he did. Everybody saw him in the afternoon. Nobody saw him in the morning. And the afternoon is not where the work happened. Father, that took me a long time to understand. I used to think the famous part was the real part. The films. The fights. The quotes. Turns out the real part was the part nobody filmed. The part he did alone. The part his own wife didn't fully see. So we have 4 fragments. Linda's paragraph. The notebooks. Kimura. Inosanto. Put them together and what you get is this. For the last 6 or 7 years of his life, and probably longer, stretching back to his teens, Bruce Lee spent 2 hours every morning, alone, doing a specific sequence of things. Sitting. Moving. Strengthening. Reading. In that order. In silence. In a room where nobody else was allowed. He came out of it, in Linda's words, more himself. And this is where the video gets harder. Because up to this point, I've just been telling you facts. Times. Sources. Page numbers. Quotes. The harder question is why? Why those 2 hours? Why alone? Why never let anyone in? Why, for a man who had a wife he loved and children he loved and students who adored him, was there this one window every day that was completely his and completely closed? My father has a theory about that. He's had 40 years to think about it. So why? Why those 2 hours? Why alone? Why, for a man who loved his wife and his children and his students, was there this one window every day that was closed? My father has had 40 years to think about this. He doesn't claim to know. He says there's no way to know. Bruce didn't write down the why, only the what. But after 40 years of reading the same paragraph, he has a theory. I'll tell you what it is, and then I'll tell you why I think he's right. Father, here's what I think. I think Bruce had figured something out that most people never figure out. He had figured out that the version of you that exists when nobody is watching is the only version of you that's actually yours. Everything else, the version your wife sees, the version your students see, the version on the screen, all of that is shaped by who's looking. You can't help it. It's not fake. It's just shaped. Other people press on you, even when they're not trying to, and you press back, and the shape of you in their presence is the shape of that pressing. It's real. But it's not all of you. Father, the 2 hours were the only time of day when nobody was pressing on him. Nobody was looking. Nobody had expectations of what he should be doing or how he should be doing it. He could be a stupid version of himself, or a slow version, or a sad version, or a confused version, and nobody would see. And if you can't be those things in front of anyone, then you need a place to be them in front of nobody. Otherwise, they don't get to exist at all. And if they don't get to exist, you're not a whole person. You're a performance. Father, I think Bruce understood that very young. I don't know how he understood it. I think it had to do with growing up famous as a child actor in Hong Kong. He'd been performing since he was 6 years old. By the time he was 19, he probably already knew that being looked at is a thing that takes from you, and that you have to put back what it takes, in private, every day, or you go empty. That's the theory. I think he's right, and here's why. If you read the notebooks carefully, and I'll be honest, I read them once for this video, my father has read them 4 times, you notice something. The morning entries are different from the afternoon entries. Bruce sometimes wrote in the notebooks during the day too, between filming, between teaching. Those daytime entries are sharp. Punchy. Confident. They sound like the Bruce Lee of the interviews. Be water. Empty your cup. Absorb what is useful. The famous lines. The lines that ended up on posters. The morning entries are different. They're rougher. They're full of doubt. There are entries where he writes things like, "Don't know what I'm doing today," or "The body is heavy this morning," or "Yesterday's session was not honest." He second guesses himself. He writes the same idea 3 different ways and crosses out 2 of them. He admits he's tired. He admits when something hurts. He admits when he doesn't understand something he thought he understood. The morning Bruce, on the page, is a person trying to figure things out. The afternoon Bruce is a person who has figured things out. The afternoon is the polished version. The morning is the work in progress. And here's the thing. The famous quotes, the ones we all know, they came out of the morning entries first. Be Water shows up in a morning notebook in 1971. The first version isn't Be Water. The first version is 3 paragraphs of Bruce trying to describe something, scratching it out, trying again, scratching that out, trying a third time. Eventually, a few weeks later, it gets compressed into the line we know. By the time the world sees it, it's clean. It's a sentence on a poster. Nobody saw the 3 paragraphs. Nobody saw the scratching out. Nobody saw the version where it didn't work yet. He kept that part for the morning. He kept that part for himself. That's what the 2 hours were for. They were the place where he was allowed to be bad at things. Allowed to be confused. Allowed to write a sentence and decide it was wrong and write it again. The polished Bruce Lee, the one in the films, the one in the interviews, the one who had an answer for everything, that Bruce only existed because every morning, for 2 hours, in a room with the door closed, the unpolished Bruce was allowed to exist too. You cannot have one without the other. That's what my father figured out, eventually. That's what page 47 was about. Father, Linda used the phrase more himself twice in the book. I told you that earlier. I want to come back to it now because I think I finally understand what she meant. She didn't mean he was happier in the morning. She didn't mean he was at peace. I think she meant, when he came out of that room, he had spent 2 hours being a person who didn't have to be Bruce Lee. He had been allowed to be tired and stupid and slow and uncertain. And once you've been allowed that, for 2 hours, you can go out into the day and be the public version of yourself without it eating you. Because the private version got fed. Father, most people never get fed. They are the public version of themselves all day long, every day, for 50 years. And then they wonder why they feel hollow at 60. They feel hollow because the private version of them never got to exist. There was never a room. There were never 2 hours. There was only ever the surface. Father, Bruce died at 32. He didn't get to 60. But I don't think he would have felt hollow. Because every morning, for the last 15 years of his life, he made sure the inside of him got 2 hours of being real before the outside of him went out and did the work. There's a line in the notebooks I want to read. It's from June 1972. About a year before he died. Morning entry. The handwriting is small. He's writing to himself. Not for publication. Not for anyone. Just for the page. He writes, the 2 hours are not for the day. The day is for the 2 hours. I had this backwards for a long time. The day is for the 2 hours. Not the other way around. That's a man who has figured out which part of his life is the real part. So now what? You watched a video about a man who got up at 4:30 for 15 years and did a thing alone in a room. What are you supposed to do with that? I want to be careful here. Because there's a version of this video that ends with, and so you should also wake up at 4:30, and here are 5 tips, and don't forget to like and subscribe. I'm not going to do that. I told you at the start I wouldn't. My father told you at the start he wouldn't. We meant it. The reason we meant it is that the specific habit isn't the point. The time isn't the point. 4:30 isn't magic. 2 hours isn't magic. Sitting, then moving, then strength, then reading, that wasn't a formula Bruce was prescribing. That was the shape his particular life took. If you copy the shape, you don't get what he got. You just get up at 4:30 and feel tired. The point isn't the shape. The point is what the shape was for. The point is that there has to be a room. There has to be some part of your day, or your week, or your life, where nobody is pressing on you. Where you are allowed to be the unpolished version. Where you can write 3 paragraphs and scratch out 2 of them and not have anyone see. Where you can be tired and stupid and slow and uncertain without performing your way out of it. Where the inside of you gets fed before the outside of you goes out and does the work. For Bruce, it was 2 hours every morning in a closed room. For my father, I think, and I've watched him for 45 years now, so I have some basis for saying this, for my father it was Sunday afternoons in his garage, with the door down, doing nothing in particular. For some people it's a long walk. For some people it's 20 minutes in the car after work before they go inside. For some people it's a notebook nobody else reads. The form doesn't matter. What matters is that the room exists. That you protect it. That you don't let it get colonized by other people's expectations, or by your phone, or by the version of yourself that you perform for everyone else. Father, I'll tell you the mistake I made, in case it's useful. For most of my 30s and 40s I thought the room was a luxury. I thought, I'll do this when I retire. I'll do this when the kids are out of the house. I'll do this when work calms down. Work didn't calm down. The kids grew up, but other things filled the space. By the time I was 60, I realized I had spent 30 years being only the public version of myself, and the private version of me was very small. Smaller than it should have been. I had let it shrink. Father, it comes back. That's the good news. You can rebuild it at any age. But it's easier to keep it than to rebuild it. So if you're young and you're watching this, keep your room. Whatever it is. Don't let anyone tell you it's selfish. Don't let anyone tell you it's a luxury. It's not. It's the place where the rest of you comes from. Father, Bruce knew that at 19. I figured it out at 60. He had a head start. There's one more thing I want to say before we end this. This video had a thumbnail that said the 2 hours Bruce Lee never showed anyone. That was true. Linda didn't see those 2 hours. His students didn't see them. The biographers mostly skipped them. The films don't show them. He never showed anyone. But here's the strange thing. Even though he never showed anyone, we still know about them. We know because Linda wrote a paragraph. We know because John Little went through the notebooks. We know because Takey and Dan, when asked, eventually said what they had observed. The 2 hours leaked out. Slowly. Over decades. Through people who loved him. That tells me something. It tells me that the room you keep for yourself is not actually hidden from the people who love you. They can feel it. They know it's there. They don't need to be inside it. What they need is to know that you have one. Because the version of you that comes out of the room, the version that is more himself, in Linda's phrase, that's the version they get to live with. And they can tell, every day, whether you've been in the room or not. Linda wrote the paragraph because she loved him, and because she knew the paragraph was the most important thing about him. Not the films. Not the fights. Not the philosophy. The paragraph. The 2 hours. The room. The book has been on my father's shelf for 50 years. Page 47 is more worn than the other pages. The pencil mark is still there. Father, I'm not going to tell you to read this book. I'm not going to tell you to wake up early. I'm not going to tell you anything. I told you at the beginning that I wouldn't. Father, what I'll tell you is this. Find your page 47. Whatever it is for you. A sentence somebody wrote that you read once when you were young, and underlined, and didn't understand. Go back to it every few years. Sit with it. Don't try to figure it out fast. Some sentences take 40 years. Father, that's all I have. That's the whole thing. The next video on this channel will be about something else. I don't know what yet. My father has a few books on the shelf I haven't asked him about. We'll see. Thank you for watching.